So we last examined the growing might of what we now call Russia within the context of throwing off Mongol rule and establishing the Tsars, specifically going from the Ivans to the Romanov dynasty. Now when we look at the map with Russian expansion, it's clear that this is going to be a process that will occur not only in stages, but it'll take place throughout various centuries. Now, Russia, as we've seen, is rich in agriculture, minerals, and furs. But when we look at these economic boons in comparison to the expansion that will occur, it's going to come at the expense of native peoples. And furs are bolded because even though furs have always been something that has formed the backbone of Russian trade and has been a symbol of wealth, profits from the fur trade were the chief incentive for Russian expansion. Now the wealthy Stroganov family paved the way into Siberia, and they hired trappers that would help speed this process up. Now, since Russian furs will be highly sought after, Western European traders would purchase them in exchange for new technologies. And the contact that these Russians had with, say, native Siberians was certainly devastating. It's going to have the same effect that occurs in the Western Hemisphere when Western Europeans have interactions with native peoples in terms of lack of resistance to disease and things of that nature. So because of the desire for these furs, the vast steppes and the forested areas, the tundras of Siberia, will officially come under Russian control. Now, large-scale settlement of Russians will lead them to outnumber the native populations. By 1720, about 700,000 Russians lived in Siberia. And this is going to mean that native Siberians are only about 30% of the actual population. Now, many natives are going to be Russified, meaning they will adopt the Russian language and convert to Christianity. And converting to Christianity, specifically Orthodox Christianity, will mean tax breaks. And they're going to be exempt from paying the yasak, which is tribute. Alright, so interestingly enough, the other side of this is migration will eventually lead Russians to overtake native populaces in some areas, but as a whole, the more areas that are conquered, the less of a majority that ethnic Russians will become. And for different colonization experience than counterparts, these Russians are going to colonize areas that they have always known about and they'd always had contact with. It's just now they're starting to assert more direct control over it. And one of the arguments that has been made is that the Russian Empire officially remained intact until 1991. Which is when the Soviet Union fell. Now, there was a historian who wrote that the British had an empire and Russia was an empire. So this kind of helps explain some of their distinctive features. And as we've seen before, with this combined geographic isolation and this experience of being conquered, Russia was an Asian and a European power. And expansion made it very militarized. And it reinforced the autocracy of the Tsars. These people you see here, the Cossacks, their cavalry expertise, along as their horsemanship and their loyalty, was relied upon to maintain discipline in these border areas. There's an identity crisis that emerges. Are the Russians Asian? Are they European? Or are they indeed something different altogether? So this growth and expansion leads us to two of the main figures of the Russian Empire, at least during the 1700s. So when you look at the map and see Russian expansion, there are two individuals that we are concerned with. One is a towering man known as Peter the Great. And Peter the Great visited Western Europe when he was a young monarch, and he believed that Russia had fallen too far behind the West when it came to technology and science. His goal is to transform Russia into a power that compares to Western Europe. And he brought the church under control of the state to symbolize who had the real power. So traditionally, these are the two pillars of Russian society. You have the Tsar, you have the Orthodox Church, and they served as a check on each other. But now the church serves the state. And the Tsar becomes more godlike under Peter's reign. Peter also seeks to reduce the power of the boyars, those landed elites that have often been more autonomous within Russian history. So he replaces the traditional Boyar Council of Moscow with a group of appointed advisors in St. Petersburg, and Peter appoints them. That comprises the table of ranks. Formerly, these positions were hereditary, but Peter abolishes that, mainly so they understand who has the real power in his new regime. Now, Peter seeks to modernize the military, and Russians were suspicious of foreigners up to this point, but he's willing to accept help from anyone who can provide it, especially if they have military expertise. So he uses conscription to fill the ranks of the army, and he opens up schools for the arts and sciences, and they're mainly military. So if you're good at geometry, it'll help with artillery. If you're good with astronomy, it'll help with navigation. So in this military buildup, he does increase taxation to pay for these changes. One of the most famous taxes is, as you see here, the beard tax, to make the nobles more Western. He forced them to wear Western dress. He also taxed beards, and if they refused to shave their beards, they had to carry a metal card that stated, "The beard is a superfluous burden." Now, in his conquests, he wants those ever-elusive warm water ports. Oddly enough, his earliest victories came against his mother, who was serving as regent and had attempted to overthrow Peter. So he placed her in a convent and he killed or exiled her followers, proving that this man is willing to do what it takes to take and keep power. Now, the Great Northern War that was waged against Sweden was his longest war. And it helped him expand Russia's holdings and gain ports on the Baltic Sea. And he also included ports on the Black Sea that wouldn't freeze in the winter as a part of his conquest. But these are all going to take a heavy toll on the peasants, who are heavily taxed and forced to serve, thus neglecting their homes. One of Peter's biggest accomplishments is building a new capital city in the West, called, appropriately, St. Petersburg. And St. Petersburg was designed more along the lines of Rome and Vienna, which means it's more Western European inspired. Moscow had more of an Asian design. And so Russia could be a power on both continents, and they could be closer to Europe and keep a better eye on developments there. Now, St. Petersburg was on the Baltic Sea, so Russia now has an administrative center that's also a port city. So Peter the Great begins this era of expansion, this absolutist rule. The concept of absolute rule refers to the Tsar being like a god, deriving his power from God himself. And it's continued towards the later part of the 1700s by Catherine the Great. Now, Catherine was actually born Sophia, and she was German. She converted to Orthodox Christianity at the time of her marriage. Now, she did seek to understand her people. She learned the Russian language, and she wanted to understand the customs, unlike her husband Peter III, who actually didn't care for Russian. And within a few months of her marriage, the royal guard helped her overthrow her husband and assume the throne for herself. And this overthrow was organized by one of her many lovers. So Catherine was able to do what was necessary, much like Peter was, to gain and hold on to power. Much like Napoleon was considered an enlightened despot before her, Catherine the Great wanted to bring the Enlightenment to Russia and continue westernizing her nation. So she attempted to make a more progressive law code. Catherine also supported the publication of numerous books, including satires on the Russian court and nobility. Now, she greatly supported the nobles, and she even weakened the power of serfs. So it proved that she understood exactly where her power came from, but she did create primary and secondary schools, and they were supposed to be open to all. But economics kept the poor out of these schools. Now, the gentry gained much more control over their land and serfs, and this will lead to numerous revolts. She routinely gave away large tracts of land, and the serfs who lived there who were a part of it. So the number of serfs did indeed increase. She was willing to brutally suppress revolts that tried to overturn this system, and the divide between the nobles and the peasants got exacerbated by the fact that they even spoke different languages. French was the language of the elite in Europe. It was the language of diplomacy and the language of the military. So the nobles spoke French. The peasants spoke Russian, so they couldn't even communicate during her time. But just as Peter the Great expanded Russia's holdings, Catherine led 2 wars against Turkey. She added Ukraine to Russia, and she even gained part of Poland. By the time of her death, the Russian Empire extended from Poland in the west to Alaska in the east, and from the Bering Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This image you see here is from Russia's Alaskan land holdings in what's called Sitka. City of Sitka is kind of a mid-sized city in Alaska, and in its time, it was known as Paris of the West because there was this convergence of native populations, of the Russian population, but other European traders who wanted to take advantage of the natural resources that the Russians were exploiting due to their expansionist efforts under Catherine the Great.